Hello and welcome to our course on Excel 2016. My name is Toby and I am your instructor on this course. I'm based in the UK and I am a Microsoft certified professional, and one of my main specialisms is in Microsoft Excel. In fact, I'm a Moz Excel specialist. Now, I'm sure you're keen to get started on learning Excel, and we're going to get started on it as soon as possible, but I do have some very important things to tell you about in this section. If you've used Excel before, it would still be a good idea for you to follow through this section. You may be able to avoid the very last part where I talk about how to acquire and install Excel. If you already have Excel installed, you probably don't need that part, but I'd like you to stick with me for most of this section. First of all then, who is this course for? Well, primarily I've written this course for people who are completely new to Excel. Now, I do assume that you have a good basic knowledge of Windows, and I do assume that you're familiar with some of the terms I'm going to use in terms of operating a modern Windows PC. You'll understand things like keyboard shortcuts, and you may even be using a touch device. I'll come back to touch devices in just a moment. If you've used a much older version of Excel, pre-2007, you might also find this course particularly useful because those early versions of Excel, a lot of things have changed. For example, there's no longer a menu system, we now use a ribbon. If you've used more recent versions of Excel, Excel 2010 or Excel 2013, the changes in Excel 2016 are mainly in more advanced topics, so in things like BI, business intelligence, and in pivot tables. There are not really many changes that affect the basics of Excel. There are one or two new features, as you'll see early on in this course, but most of the features at the basic to intermediate level have not changed substantially from Excel 2013 to Excel 2016. Also, if you've used another spreadsheet product and you'd really like to learn Excel, many of the features of that other spreadsheet product will probably be very similar to Excel. So, for example, you'll be familiar with the rows and columns and cells. But it is important that you follow through this course systematically, because it's the details where products tend to differ. And whereas in another product you may be able to say add the values of some numbers in a column in one way, in Excel it might well be completely different. So really this course is aimed at complete newcomers, people who have used other products but want to learn Excel, and people who've used much earlier versions of Excel than 2016. Now, if you have used a more recent version of Excel, I will try to point out at various times where the main new changes are, so you can pay particular attention to those. The next very important point is that particularly with Excel 2016, as with the rest of Office 2016, you now have versions of Excel which are different on different devices. So you have the conventional desktop copy of Excel, either the PC version, which is the version we're using here, or the Mac version, but you also have versions of Excel that can run on devices such as tablets, and that can also basically run in a browser, what's called the Office mobile apps, and specifically here Excel mobile app. This course is about the desktop version of Excel, if you like, the conventional version, the version that some people call the full fat version of Excel, the one with everything in it. The mobile apps are very good, particularly for use on mobile devices, but they are still cut down versions of the desktop apps, and it's the desktop app that we're looking at in this course. Given the number of devices that you can now run Excel on, it's not surprising that you may well be considering operating Excel using a touch device, using your fingers rather than using a keyboard and mouse. On this course I am primarily using a keyboard and mouse. I will demonstrate some items using touch. The device I'm recording this course on handles both keyboard and mouse and touch. And in fact, you can also use gestures in front of the screen, although it's rather difficult to record those on a course like this. But primarily, I'll be using keyboard and mouse. Now, from this point onwards in this section, I'm going to be talking about the requirements to run Excel 2016 and how you can acquire it. So if you're already running, you may not need to watch the section beyond this point. I still recommend that you follow it through, because hopefully the information I'm going to give you and the links I'm going to be indicating will be helpful to you. Just before you leave, if you're going to though, just point out that I'm running on Windows 10. So I'm going to be using Excel 2016 on Windows 10 on this course. Now, the system requirements for Office get more complicated every time I look at them, and because there are so many ways that you can get Office and therefore Excel now, so many different configurations, there are a lot of different system requirements. Looking at the list here, you have sort of 5 routes really. You have the Office 365 subscription plans, whereby you basically buy a subscription to 365. It gives you some online facilities, and in most cases you get downloadable desktop applications as well, although not in all cases. So make sure that if you're going to use an Office 365 subscription to follow this course, that you do get the downloadable Excel 2016. You can buy the Office 2016 suite, so you can buy a suite of desktop applications which is only the desktop applications. You do get one or two things as well. You get things like cloud storage, come back to that later. You can also run Office 2016 and therefore Excel 2016 on certain Office server products, and you can still buy Office standalone applications. So for instance, you can just buy Excel 2016 as a standalone application. You don't have to get it as part of Office, although an awful lot of people do. So let's suppose you decide to buy an Office 2016 suite that will include Excel 2016. Amongst the options are Office Home and Student 2016, and the requirements listed there include the available operating systems: Windows 10, Windows 8.1, Windows 8, Windows 7 Service Pack 1. If you're still on Vista or XP, I'm afraid you're out of luck as far as Excel 2016 is concerned. You're going to need to upgrade your operating system. At the time of recording, of course, Windows XP is already obsolete, and of course Vista's days are numbered now as well. So the first thing to do is to check that your hardware is up to running Excel on its own if you're going to buy the standalone product, or Office 2016 in one of its various configurations, and then you also need to ensure that you have a suitable operating system. Now, something to bear in mind whenever I show you pages like this one from Microsoft.com or Office.com is that these pages, by the time you see this video, have probably been changed and updated. So you always need to go to the relevant link in order to get the latest information. The link itself, of course, may change. So my advice usually is to go to Microsoft.com and use the search facility, and in this case, search for system requirements for Office to see the latest version of this information. So if you haven't got Excel 2016 yet, how do you get hold of a copy? Well, first of all, you check your hardware and your software are up to the job, as I indicated just now. Then you either buy a copy or you get a free trial version. You can buy a copy from your local computer store, probably. You can buy copies online, either from Microsoft themselves or from other well-known online retailers, and I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. Or you can get a trial version. There's a try for free version here for home or for business. So let's say try for free for home. And that gives us the option to try Office 365 for free. Now, I won't keep saying this, but I will say it just this once more. Don't forget, these pages may well have changed by the time you come to use this video, and this trial offer may also change. But basically, at the time of recording this, fairly typically a 1-month free trial based on Office 365. So pretty good deal, and if you crack on with it, you can probably get through this course in a month, including doing the exercises, and then you'll be fully confident in Excel before you actually spend money on it. One thing that I certainly won't be covering on this course is how to install and activate Office 2016 or Excel 2016 on your device. There are so many different options now that you really need to go to Microsoft.com to check that. For example, if you go to Office 365 Frequently Asked Questions and scroll down there are a couple of very useful sections here. There's a section on Office Trials which will tell you about the setup for trials, the steps you need to take to sign up for a trial, for example. And then further down on this page, it's got sections there such as how do I install Office? How can I install Office on my Mac? And so on. The instructions you need are there embedded within these pages with links to various other locations on Microsoft.com or Office.com. That's a much better source for information about installing Office or Excel than I can provide. And of course you should always look for the most up-to-date information. So from this point onwards, I'm going to assume that you have Excel installed. And from my Windows 10 desktop, what I'm going to do is go down to the search box down there and start typing Excel. And there is Excel 2016. Note desktop app, it's the desktop app that we need. And when Excel 2016 starts up, you should see something like this. Now I'm going to explain this screen to you a little bit more in a couple of sections time, and that's where we're going to carry on and start using Excel, but I've got one or two other things to explain first, and the first of those is the location and use of the course files and the exercise files we're going to be using throughout this course, and that's what we're going to cover in the next section. So the first thing you need to do is to make sure that you can start up the Excel 2016 desktop app and that you can see something like this. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to the course. What you're looking at the moment in File Explorer is a list of the course files that are provided as part of this course. There are quite a few of them, around about 45. This list may not be absolutely accurate, but it should be pretty close. And it's a rather strange looking list of files, but as you work through the course, these are the files you may want to refer to if you want, for example, to try the things that I do during the course. Some of the files, for instance, businessexpenses.xlsx, go to a number of versions. You can see them numbered there, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And these versions of each file correspond to the development of the file during the course. So we start off with businessexpenses.xlsx. We do a certain number of things to it in the course, and I save that as business expenses 2. A little bit later on we do some more work, that's business expenses 3, and so on. You should normally be able to match the version of the file to the particular work that we're doing during the course. By looking at the top of the screen, you'll see the particular file name of the file that I'm working on. I do strongly recommend that you keep the originals somewhere safe, because if you do work on one of these files and something goes wrong, you break it, you do something, you can't really figure out what you've done wrong, it's always good to be able to go back to the original. Now this second folder, the exercise folder, contains the exercise files for the course, and in essence these correspond to the 9 exercises that I set during the course. There are one or two slight complications there. For instance, for exercise 6 there are 2 files, there's a PDF and an XLSX, and for exercise 2 and exercise 9 I provide you with the A file to start you off, and the B file is my sample answer. In all other cases, 1, 3, 4, 5, 7 and 8, the file that I provide there is my sample answer to the exercise. Once again, I strongly suggest that you keep the originals of all of these in case something goes horribly wrong and you need to refer back to the original. That's it. Make sure you get both lots of files downloaded and you know where they are. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. In this short section I'm going to talk to you a little about what's new in Excel 2016. Now, for those of you who are new to Excel, you won't really know what's old in Excel 2016, so this may not really help you very much. But for those of you who are looking for an update, let me just give you a brief overview of what is new. The page that I'm looking at now is on office.com, and it lists the new and improved features in Office 2016. If you work your way through the contents of this page, you'll see that many of the features apply to Excel. And in fact, some of the major features which are specific to Excel are really at a much more advanced level than the level we're going to in this course. So, for example, there are some much improved features in relation to what's called BI, Business Intelligence, and in relation to pivot tables. But there are also some new chart types, and we'll be looking at charts later on in this course. And a particular new feature which is pretty much across the board in Office 2016, which is the Autofit feature. Another broadly available feature is the extension to the available Office themes, and I'll be looking at that quite early on in this course. Many of the other features, such as those related to sharing and features such as Smart Lookup, are either going to look at much later on or in a later one of our series of courses, or in one or two cases such as Smart Lookup. It's probably a good idea to try it out yourself early on in your use of Excel 2016. So there are a few of the key points which have broader application. If you want to see the new and improved features specific to Excel, if we click on Excel here, that takes us to this page, which gives us information about the new chart types, and then about those more advanced features: get and transform, one-click forecasting, 3D maps, and then those specifics that I've already mentioned, one of them being Tell Me, which we're going to look at a little bit later on in the course, Smart Lookup, which you might want to read up about and try out for yourself. You'll find it on the Review tab on the ribbon in Excel 2016. You'll know what I mean by that a little bit later on. And then we also have details of the new themes. Again, we'll be looking at that in a little while on this course. So useful information there about what's new in Excel 2016. Some of it really won't mean much to you at the moment, but hopefully by the end of this course, quite a bit of it will. That's the end of. Welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. As I mentioned before, we're actually using Windows 10 here, and before we start to create a workbook, and before we actually start working Excel, I'm going to pin Excel to the Windows 10 taskbar to make it easy for me to start Excel. Now, depending on which version of Windows you're using, Windows 7, Windows 8, 8.1, you may want to pin Excel to the taskbar, or maybe put a shortcut to Excel onto your desktop. Now, if you're not sure how to do those things, go to Microsoft.com, search on those. There are various links there to explain how to do it. In the case of Windows 10, if I just click in the search box down the bottom here and start typing Excel, I soon see Excel 2016. If I right click on that, one of the options is Pin to Taskbar. And I now have a little icon on the taskbar which I can use as a shortcut for starting Excel. Let me now click on that icon, and Excel starts. Now, first of all, on the left I have a recent files list, and you'll see that the recent files list is actually empty. So, to all intents and purposes, this is the first time that I'm using Excel on this device. If I already have some workbooks, perhaps workbooks that I got from somebody else, or workbooks that I've created in an earlier version of Excel, I could use this Open Other Workbooks option here, but I'll come back to that a little bit later on in this section. Now, what I'm actually going to do in this section is to take you on a sort of whistle-stop tour of creating and saving one or two workbooks in Excel 2016, just to give you a sort of general idea of how the whole thing works. Now, if I want to create a workbook, a new workbook, which is going to be almost the first thing that I do, I can start with one of these what are called templates on the right. Now, if you look at that template, for example, the one I've highlighted, academic calendar. If I were to select that, it would give me the option of creating a workbook which can be used as an academic calendar, and much of the structure of the workbook that I needed would be contained within that template. Now I am going to come back to templates later on, so I'm not going to worry too much about them at the moment. What I'm going to do is the very first option. I'm going to choose here blank workbook, which will give me a blank workbook. However, a couple of things first. First of all, I suggest that if you haven't used Excel before, or you've only used a very old version of Excel, one of the first things you do is to take this tour of Excel. I'm not going through it now, I'm going to leave you to go through that yourself, but it is a very useful tour. The other thing that I'm going to do before we create our first workbook is I'm going to sign in to an account. Now this is a particular aspect of using Office in general and Excel in particular that gets a lot of people very confused. Try and briefly explain it here, but clearly enough that you know which account you need to sign in with. First of all, why do you sign in to an account? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Probably the main reason is from a licensing point of view, and of course Microsoft, like all other software providers, are very keen to make sure that users of the software are properly licensed. So generally they want you to sign into an account, and then they know who you are, and particularly that you've paid for the software that you're using. But there are other reasons as well, and one of them is that to give you access to your cloud storage, your OneDrive account with Excel 2016, so that you can securely and safely save workbooks online, so that you can share them with other people, or in fact with your own other devices. It's important to sign in securely with an account as well. So there are good reasons for signing into an account. Which account you sign into very much depends on the nature of your Excel 2016 application. If, for example, you bought Excel either as a standalone product or as part of Office 2016, you may just sign in with a regular Microsoft account. But if you've got Excel 2016 as part of Office 365, or perhaps as part of your employer's Office 365, then you need to make sure that you're signing in with an appropriate account that gives you access to the license which you're using to run Excel 2016. Now in my case, this copy of Excel 2016 is provided via an Office 365 business account. So the account is in the name of my employer, Toby A, and as an individual person with a license within that corporate Office 365 account, I'm just TA. So I'm going to sign in as TA within my company. Now if all of this sounds like mumbo, you want to find out more about it, if you click on this Learn More link here, it gives you access to a pretty good explanation of the sort of licensing Microsoft account factors, and explains what you need to do and why you need to do it largely. So have a read through there if you're not clear on which account to use and why you use an account at all. But I am now going to sign in as me. So put in my email address. Before I go any farther, you'll see that email address quite a bit actually during the course. I should point out that is not a monitored email address. I don't reply to emails on that email address. So it's not even worth trying to send me an email because I won't reply to it. It's only used to access this Office 365 version of Excel 2016. So having put in my email address, now my password, and once I've successfully signed in, as you can see at the top right there, you can now see my name and my email address. Now it is important to realize that I'm not restricted to only running this using one account. So I could have this set up to run a number of accounts. So say colleagues that share a PC can each log in with their own account to use this installation of Excel. But I will generally during this course stick with that one account from now on. So it's finally time to create a workbook. We're going to create a blank workbook. We're creating it from this screen, which is called the Start screen. That name will be important a little bit later on. So I'm going to click on Blank Workbook, and I get a blank workbook. Now the workbook is in effect a set of worksheets, and by default in Excel 2016 you get one worksheet when you create a workbook, and the name of the worksheet is on this tab at the bottom. It's just by default called Sheet 1. Now below where it says Sheet 1 you've got a thing called a status bar, and I'm going to tell you about that in a later section. And above the sheet is this whole rectangular area here. There is an entry bar, and there is the ribbon, and above them you have what's called the Quick Access Toolbar. Now all of these I'm going to be covering in the coming sections in quite a bit of detail. For the moment I just want to concentrate on putting some data into the worksheet itself. Now before I do, I hope you remember me to tell those of you particularly who are using touch about touch and mouse mode. Make sure that you're in mouse mode if you're using a mouse, because you get more commands on them, and you're going to find it's a lot easier to be accurate when you're using mouse and keyboard. Now looking at this worksheet, it's arranged in a sort of grid, and the grid is made up of horizontal rows. The rows are numbered, so row 2, row 3, the numbers are down the left hand edge there, and there are many rows that you cannot see. You can see numbers 1 to 39 there, but if I scroll down you can in fact have thousands of rows, thousands and thousands of them. They go on apparently forever. The columns are vertical, and they're referred to by letters normally, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, although in fact you can switch to numbering those as well, but the default is to use letters. When you get to Z, whoever invented Excel said, oh, I've got to Z, have I got to stop there? And somebody else said, no, let's call the next AA, AB, and so on. And again, you can have thousands and thousands of columns. Now at an intersection of a row and a column, you have something called a cell. And the left cell there, the one that's currently selected, you can see the board around it, is the cell A1. We normally refer to it by its column letter A and its row number 1. So this, for instance, is cell L5, and this one is G7. Now the first thing that I'm going to do, rather unexcitedly, is to put some data into this worksheet. And when a cell is selected, to put, say, a number in, all I need to do is to type the number on my keyboard. So what about 23? Now that number having appeared, you'll notice that the cursor is still flashing to the right of the 3 within the cell. And in order to work in another cell, I need to select another cell. So let's select the cell next to it, H7, and let's put a different number in H7. Let's put in there 19. Again, let's click in I7, put a different number in there, 62, and so on. In a cell you can put numbers, words, you could show the dates, you can do arithmetic, you can add stuff up, and you can also format the cells, as we'll see later on. You can change the colour of the characters, the numbers in this case. You can put a border around a cell, and all sorts of exciting things with cells, and we'll be covering those later on in the course. But for the moment, all I've done here is to put a number in each of 3 cells. Now generally speaking, when you're working in Excel and you're making workbooks, each book being made up of 1 or more worksheets, you are going to want to save what you've done. You have to save your work. So the first thing I'm going to do now is to save this workbook. Now in order to do that, we go into what is called Backstage View, or just Backstage. And to access Backstage View, we click on this word File up here. It's actually the leftmost word above the main body of the ribbon. So click on File, and it takes us into this Backstage View. And one of the options there is Save As. Clicking on Save as in general with Windows software, gives me a facility to save the work I'm doing, in this case the workbook, as a file, and I can save it in one of a number of different places. Now this is where things get a little bit more complicated, in that exactly which places you have available to you will not be the same as the places that I have available to me. Because my Excel is a company 365 account, I have a OneDrive location I could save it to. I have a SharePoint site I could save it to. I have a personal OneDrive I could save it to. I can also save it to this PC, and on this occasion I'm going to save it to this PC. Now, I mentioned to you earlier on the demo files, the course files that I'm using. I'm going to save this in an empty version of that demo file, that course file folder, and then during the course, as you'll see, I'll build up to the collection of files that you've seen already much earlier on in the course. And these, of course, are files that you have access to, so you can see these files. So from this PC, I'm going to browse to that particular folder. So I use a standard Windows file browse there, and there is the empty folder where I'm going to save this particular workbook. Now, the default file extension for an Excel workbook is XLSX, and I'm going to call this one, not a very exciting name I know, I'm going to call it Demo 1. Now, it's quite okay to put spaces in file names. Some people don't like them, but I don't mind them at all. Having name in, I click on Save. And my workbook is now safely saved. Not only is it safely saved, but if you look at the top middle of the screen, you'll see that the name I've given it is now displayed at the top middle of the screen. A workbook, when you create a new one, gets a default name like Book 1 or Book 2. Once you've given it your own name, then that's the name it'll stick with from now on, unless of course you decide to change it later on. So I've created a workbook and I've saved it and I've put some numbers in it. The numbers are rather unexciting, they're not doing anything useful at the moment. But let's suppose I've finished work for the moment. One option available to me now is to close this workbook. It's not a good idea to leave workbooks open. Somebody might come along, lean on your keyboard, accidentally put some numbers in there. To close the workbook, if I go back into Backstage View again, one of the options there is Close. So let me click on Close. That workbook is closed. And now note that Excel is still open, but I have no workbook open. The area that was occupied by the workbook and its single worksheet is now blank. And this is the point at which we're going to resume in the second half of this getting started part of the course. So please join me for that. Welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. In this section we're going to look at the very important subject of Excel options. And Excel options are used basically to customize and personalize your installation of Excel, your use of Excel. Now, in the very early stages of learning Excel, many of these options won't really mean very much to you. So we will come back to them from time to time later on, and I'll explain the options you need as we go through the balance of the course. But before we really get started with Excel, you need to make sure that a few basic options are set up in the way that you need them to be. Now, although Excel options will appear at various points during your use of Excel 2016, the conventional way to access them is from Backstage View. So the first thing I'm going to do is to go into Backstage View, and one of the pages is Options. It's the second one from the bottom here. And that brings up the Excel Options dialog. Now, this dialog is made up of a number of pages, and the first page is General. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then we have Formulas, Proofing, and so on. And most of these pages we won't really be looking at all until later stages of the course. But we are going to start with 2 or 3 of them, and in particular we're going to start with the General page. Now, I'm going to cover the items on the General page in a sort of haphazard order, but there is a reason for doing them in the sequence that I'm going to go through them. So I want to start with this section, Personalize your copy of Microsoft Office. And this selection will actually affect the whole of Microsoft Office, not just Excel. First of all, your username. Now your username will be particularly important if, for example, you are working with others on documents and you're adding comments, you're annotating workbooks, etc., and you want to keep a track of who has made whatever comment or even who has made changes to a workbook, then these can be identified using the username that you've set up here. By default, it gets the username associated with the account that you're running Excel under, but you can change that name. Some people use a nickname rather than their real name here. Note the checkbox under there to say always use these values regardless of sign into Office. So if you want to use those values whichever account you're signing into Office with, then you just check that box. Now there are then two settings which also relate to Office in general. There's the Office background and the Office theme. Now I currently have the background set to no background and the Office theme set to colourful. My settings are primarily set that way in order to make it as easy as possible for you to see what's on the screen. But choose to go for something a little bit more dynamic than this. One very important point here, let's suppose that I change the background to say underwater. You won't see any particular change happening, and in fact whatever changes you make when you're adjusting the Excel options are only activated when you click OK. So I'm currently set on underwater colourful. Just take a look at the top right hand area of the screen when I click on OK. You might just about see there some fishes and various other underwater creatures appearing there. It's a bit difficult to see with the colourful setting. It's a little bit easier if I change from colourful to white as my Office theme. Don't forget the Office themes were extended in Excel 2016. Let's click on OK and you can see the underwater background there. Now the background and theme varying levels of, if you like, in-your-faceness, and generally speaking they're quite subdued, but you may want to choose something that suits your particular style. Now I want to go to the top of the general page and look at user interface options. I mentioned earlier on in the course screen tips as a sort of help in Excel 2016, and if I hover over one of the entries on this page, that one for example, a screen tip comes up, show mini toolbar on selection. And there is also under that what's called a screen tip description, so if you like some fuller information about the screen tip. Now although in the early stages of using Excel you'll probably find very useful, they can be quite annoying because they can get in the way of things, and when you've been using Excel for a while you probably get to the point that you don't really need them. You can switch them off. In fact, when I'm recording this, in many ways it would be better if I switch them off, because quite often they get in the way of what I'm trying to show you. But I am keeping them switched on because I think the tips themselves are very useful in the early stages of learning Excel. Now the way that you control them is using this screen tip style setting here. Show feature descriptions in screen tips. Supposing I change that now and say don't show feature descriptions in screen tips, what do you think would happen if I hovered over that top option again? Well, of course you still see the whole thing. Don't forget you have to click on OK. Now if I hover over a command on the ribbon, all you see is the name of the command. It just says merge and center. Go back into options again. Let's say change that back to show feature descriptions. Click on OK. I'm going to hover over merge and center again. Now I get merge and center and the description. And once again, that's an option that you may want to set very early on in your use of Excel and may want to change later on when perhaps the screen tips become unnecessary for you. And one other thing, if you look down at the bottom of the general page, the very bottom option there, show the start screen when this application starts. We've seen the start screen several times already on the course. If you don't particularly need to see the start screen, if you'd like to open straight into Excel, disable that option and you won't see the start screen anymore. And you might want to just try that just to get used to using Excel options, and then if you do want the start screen you can switch it back on again. Now, one other option that I'd like to mention early on, or in fact one other group, is this section when creating new workbooks. Now, it may well be that you want to start all of your workbooks a particular font, perhaps a particular font size. Perhaps you need the text to be a little bit bigger, or you like it to be a little bit smaller. You can adjust that here. The other thing you'll notice here, and this may be of interest particularly to those of you who've used a much earlier version of Excel, the bottom option there, include this many sheets, says 1. That controls how many empty sheets you get when you create a new workbook, and by default it's set as 1, as I mentioned earlier. In much earlier versions of Excel, always 3, but if you'd like to get 3 or some other number every time you create a workbook, you can change that there. Let's now turn our attention to the Save page. Now, there are a couple of very important things on the Save page. One of them, near the top there, is Save Auto Recover Information, and by default that is checked. That means that at the interval you select there, by default it's 10 minutes, what Excel does is to save a copy of your work. So that if something goes horribly wrong, for example if you're working on a PC or some other device that doesn't have a battery, or indeed if your battery just goes flat in the middle of doing some work, you don't lose what you've been doing. At least you only lose back to the last auto save. I strongly recommend that you have auto recover set, because it does mean that you won't lose hours of work in the event of, for example, as I said, a power cut or something like that, or even a software or hardware failure of some other sort. The other useful setting here is this one, default local file location. If when you want to save to your computer, not to the cloud but to your computer, you want to by default save in a particular location, you can set that location here. As you can see, Excel has used a default local file location. That's its default. So change that if you'd like to. The third page that I'd like to look at now is the language page. You need to make sure that you have the language that you use, or languages that you use, set up. I use English United States and English United Kingdom, more or less 50-50, but English United States is set as my default. You can add additional languages if you'd like to. There's a very, very long list of languages here. And the other thing to bear in mind is that some people, including me in some cases, work in a situation where they may be working on a workbook which is in one language, but their language is a different language. So for instance, I might edit a workbook which has information in Spanish, and I may want to, for example, spell check in Spanish, but I'd like all of the display, the help information and so on in English, because I am an English speaker. So you have the editing languages at the top if you like the languages that you're using within the workbooks, but then here choose display and help languages if you'd actually, for example, like to work on an English workbook but your mother tongue is French, then you may want to set the editing language at English and the display and help language at French. But do make sure that you have your language or languages set correctly. So they're the things I'd like you to make sure that you have set correctly before we go any farther. Of course, you'll potentially change them later on. Make sure they're okay. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. In this section, I'm going to cover the use of the ribbon in some detail. If you've used a relatively recent version of Excel before, you may be pretty familiar with the ribbon and you may well not need to go through this section at all. If on the other hand you haven't used the ribbon before, or you've used a much older version of Excel, maybe one of the early versions that use the ribbon, or you want to find out about key tips or auto hiding the ribbon, then I suggest you through this section, because I'm going to try to cover it fairly thoroughly to give you all of the basic things you need to know to get the best out of using the ribbon. The ribbon is this rectangular area here, and above the rectangular area there are individual words or phrases, and these correspond to the tabs. The ribbon is actually made up of a number of tabs. You can't see all of the tabs here at the moment. Some of them are only shown under certain circumstances. You can in fact add your own tabs. But the ones you see here are the basic defaults. A couple of exceptions. On the left, the word file there, as you know, gives you access to Backstage View. Technically it's not really a ribbon tab at all. And on the right we have the new Tell Me feature. So in fact the ribbon I've got here has 7 tabs: Home, Insert, Page Layout, Formulas, Data, Review. If you see a different list to that, or will be revealed later to explain what that is. Now one thing to notice straight away is that Home is highlighted. We say that the Home tab is selected, but on the ribbon you see a lot of greyed out controls. Most of those are various types of command. They're ways of doing things to your Excel workbooks. But on the Home tab they are currently all greyed out, and the reason they're greyed out is that you couldn't actually use any of them at the moment. And the reason you can't use them at the moment is because I don't have a workbook open. Now let me open one of the recently opened workbooks. So let me go into Backstage View. Let's try Demo 1 again. And you see that the controls on the Home tab on the ribbon are no longer grayed out. You could actually use those commands. And in fact, if I click on a couple of the other tabs, let's look at the Insert tab, they are not grayed out either. Let's go to Page Layout, Formulas. Now when you get to Formulas, are 1 or 2, there's one there, a command that's still grayed out. Now the fact that that's grayed out means that I couldn't do whatever it does at the moment with my current situation. So let's go back to the Home tab then, and let's see what we can do. Let's suppose I type in the currently selected cell the word hello. Now having typed hello, if I click on the enter tick there next to the formula bar, now I'm going to go up to the B command here, the one that I've currently got selected, bold. I'm going to click that and it makes the text in that cell bold. Now the commands on each tab of the ribbon are divided into groups, and the groups are separated by these tiny little thin vertical lines. So on the Home tab you have a clipboard group, a font group, note the name at the bottom of the groups, an alignment group, a number group, and so on. On the Insert tab you have a tables group, an illustrations group, an add-ins group, and so on. And within each group you have individual controls. So for instance, on the Page Layout tab, in the Themes group, you have a Themes button, a Colors button, a Fonts button, and an Effects button. So you have a structure to the ribbon. You have the ribbon, you have the tabs, you have the groups, you have the controls. So let's look now at some of the other aspects of these controls. There are very many different groups, and if you take for example the one on the left of the Home tab, the Paste button, it's actually a 2-part button. Many of them are 2-part buttons. I've currently got the cursor over the top half of the button, and you notice the screen tip there, Paste. Control plus V is the keyboard shortcut, and then there's that screen tip description. We talked about these earlier in the course. Add content on the clipboard to your document. Now the lower half of the same button with the arrow is actually a drop down which gives us a selection of options, and this selection will be dependent on the exact situation that you're in. So depending on what you're pasting into and what you've got on the clipboard, you'll get a selection of options there. Now some of the other buttons, like this cut button here for example, is a straightforward simple button. To the right in the font group we have a font selection drop down list here. So if I click on the arrow, I have a list of all the fonts available on my device that I can use, and to the right of that I have a list of available sizes. Now sometimes, as with this font size list, although you have a number of available sizes, so as you can see here 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, if I selected 12 that's fine, but I can actually type in a size as well, so I could type in 13 if I wanted 13 point. So you're not necessarily limited to the sizes in the actual button. So the controls correspond to various types of commands. Some of them are simple click buttons, there's drop downs, there's split buttons and so on. And during the course we'll be looking at these many different types of control and command. If you take the font group here, for example, there are quite a few commands in there that enable you to, for instance, make text bold or italicize it or underline it. And as you've already seen, you can change the font that's used and the font size and so on. So you have a whole selection of buttons and options, but in the bottom right hand corner of the font group there is a tiny little button that's called a dialog box launcher. And if I click on the dialog box, that's that one there, it brings up a conventional type of dialog. It's a format cells dialog, and the font page within that dialog is selected. So if rather than use all of those individual buttons you want to use a dialog like this one, as I say, a much more conventional type of control in Excel, you can certainly do that, and many people, including me, sometimes prefer to bring up a dialog and make a whole load of things at once, and then obviously once I've made all my selections I click OK to activate them, or if I change my mind or want to start again I can use the cancel button to cancel. Note the question mark there, which will normally take me through to online help on the particular dialog, the selected page that I'm using at that time. Sometimes, let me just cancel this, sometimes if you go to a regular command like this one, conditional formatting, you get a drop down list of possible options. If I go to say manage rules here, I get a dialog that enables me to manage my conditional formatting rules. So there are many situations in which dialogs appear, and they in turn will have many options, and sometimes a better option or a more convenient option than using the individual commands on the ribbon. Let me just close that one. Let's move on to some of the ways of using the ribbon that you may not be familiar with, even if you've used it before. The ribbon takes up quite a bit of space, and quite often when you're working in Office programs in general, Excel in particular, space is at a premium, and you may want or need to use some of the space that's occupied by the ribbon. One of the complaints that's often made about the ribbon is that it takes too much space on the screen. The top right hand corner of the Excel window there is a button. It's ribbon display options, and if you click on ribbon display options there are three. There's auto hide, show tabs and show tabs and commands, and by default tabs and commands is selected. That's basically seeing all of the detail of the ribbon. If I switch to show tabs, watch what happens. The ribbon itself is no longer visible and all I can see is the tabs. Now you may think that's going to be a little bit problematic. You think, well, how the heck do I find all of the commands that I need? You'd normally use this option when you're already fairly familiar with where everything is on the ribbon, and you don't need to be able to see the ribbon to find the things that you want. So for example, let's suppose I wanted to make the word hello in I-10 italic. I know it's on the home tab in the font group, so all I need to do is to click the home tab, and then as if by magic the ribbon appears. I find the command I want, in this case the italic command. Watch what happens when I click on italic. That's italicized. I could underline as well if I wanted to, do anything else I want to it, and as soon as I finish what I'm doing the ribbon disappears again and gives me that space back. Now if at any time I want to switch back to the ribbon being shown all the time, I choose the third option. Now an even more extreme option is auto hide ribbon, and this hides the ribbon and the tabs. Now you may think it's actually quite difficult to do anything at all without being able to even see the tabs, but if all you need to do is to click up here at the very top, and the tabs and the ribbon itself will reappear for you to do something. So let's say switch off the underlining here and switch off the italic again, and then as soon as I've finished, the ribbon is hidden once I've completed the operations I'm performing there. You might use this function, for example, if all you want to do is to enter some data into the cells in a book, or to use features whereby you don't need the ribbon at all. Believe me, it will happen from time to time. And then at whatever point you finish with that, it's very straightforward to go back to one of the other settings, because you still have up here the ribbon display options button. You can click that, and you could, for example, go straight back to showing tabs and commands again. Now let me look at a couple of other useful features of the ribbon. I've already mentioned going into touch mode if you're using a touch device. Don't forget the button there that lets you switch between mouse mode and touch mode. And of course, in touch mode, everything is spaced out more for your fingers. And another very useful feature, particularly for people with certain types of disability, but in many cases for people who prefer to use a keyboard to use a mouse, there is a very useful feature that's known as using key tips. Now, if you operate the ribbon and its commands using the keyboard rather than mouse, the problem you have knowing what all of the keyboard shortcuts and key sequences are. If you press the Alt key, just press it, release it, you are given a set of single key stroke ways of accessing the tabs on the ribbon. In fact, if you above those, you'll also see some numbered keys for the Quick Access Toolbar. We're going to look at the Quick Access Toolbar in the next section. But let's suppose I now want to go to the Page Layout tab. I don't want to use the mouse. All I need to do is to press the P key on the keyboard. That not only takes me to the Page Layout tab, but it also gives me a set of single and double key combinations that enable me to operate the commands on this tab. So if, for example, I wanted to check or change the orientation of the pages here, if I press the O key, it actually operates the orientation key, and then I can choose using the up and down arrows whether I want my pages to be portrait or landscape orientation. And when you finish using this particular feature, if the key tips are still visible, you can just press the Alt key to hide them again. In the early stages of using Excel 2016, the tabs that you see there and the commands on those tabs are probably going to be plenty for the kind of things that you're going to be doing. But there are other tabs, as I mentioned before, and in fact you can even create your own tab and put your own groups and commands on it. Now, we're not going to go into this customization of the ribbon here, but I am going to talk about customization in relation to the Quick Access Toolbar in the next section, and on the basis of that you may want to try to experiment with a little bit of customization. Let me just show you where that happens. If you click on the File tab to go into Backstage View and go into Options, one of the pages there is Customize Ribbon. And from there, not only can you customize the ribbon from the point of view of adding your tabs and so on, but you can also, for example, make some tabs visible or invisible. So for example, if you look at these check boxes down here, the Developer tab is not shown. If I check that now, you'd also see a Developer tab. So that's all of the basics about the ribbon for now. One thing I haven't gone into is the new Tell Me feature, and I'm going to cover that in a couple of sections from now. Although it's on the ribbon, it works in a subtly different way really to the rest of the ribbon, and as it's a new feature, I've set aside a separate short section for that. So that's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next. Hello again, and welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. In this section we're going to start to look in more detail at how to enter and edit data in Excel 2016, and then I'm going to set you your first actual exercise on the course. Now, before I start, I am once again going to be basically working with mouse and keyboard. I will refer to touch once or twice. If you are using a touch device, you'll either need an on-screen keyboard, so you'll get the equivalent of this, or if you have an external keyboard for your touch device, you need to have that set up. You're going to be entering quite a bit of text and numbers during this and subsequent sections. The other thing to bear in mind is that in this and the next few sections, I'm really going to be concentrating on getting the numbers in and formatting them in the sense of making sure that dates look like dates and so on. The actual cosmetics, how pretty what we're doing looks, is something we're going to come back to later on in the course. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is to start work on a new workbook. And to make a new workbook, you've already seen how to do that. You so use a keyboard shortcut. The keyboard shortcut is Control N. So there is my new workbook, and what we're going to put in this workbook is we're going to do a very simple monthly electricity account. So the first thing I'm going to do is to save with the name monthly electricity. There we are. And now what I'm going to do is to enter the months of the year. Now, you've already seen that we can actually use a series fill feature here. I'll come to that again in just a moment. The first thing I'm going to do is just select a cell. Doesn't really matter which one at this stage. I'm going to type in the first month of the year, which of course is January. Now, when I finish typing January, if I press the Enter key, two things happen. First of all, I leave that cell, and that cell has its value January in it. But also notice that the selection, the cell selection, goes to the next cell below. And that lines me up well for typing in February. Now, if you've typed, you press the Enter key, by default, the cell that's selected next is the cell below the one you've just typed in. But if instead of hitting the Enter key, I'd use the Enter, the tick mark on the formula bar, and if I use that now after typing February, watch what happens. February is entered, but I've now still got the same cell selected. So, although our same content, my next selection is different depending on how I terminate entry of data into a cell. If I now want to go to K10, I'm of course clicking K10, enter March, and of course now I've got the same options, but also I can terminate entry in a cell by just clicking anywhere else on the sheet. So it's important to recognize that when you're entering data, what happens after you've entered that data depends on essentially what you do at the end of the entry. Now, the next thing I want to do is to use the feature that we saw before to get all of the months of the year quickly without having to type them all. So I've selected January. I'm going to use the little symbol on the bottom right hand corner of the border there, drag down the requisite number of months, release, and I have all of the months of the year. Now notice that when we get down to September and November and December, they're actually slightly too wide to fit in the available space, and they spill over apparently into the next column. Now in fact they're not in the next column at all, and September, for example, is wholly within the K16 cell. But because we haven't told it otherwise, what happens when something's too wide for the cell is that Excel lets it just display over the next one. Now, one way of getting round this is to make column K wider. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. One way of doing it is if you hover over the top of the column, over the K itself, you see that down pointing arrow. If I move to the right until it becomes a vertical bar with two arrows, one pointing out each side, and click with the mouse, I can actually drag to make that column wider, and I can drag it to pretty much any width that I like. As an alternative to that, let me just put it back. In fact, I'll overdo it and make it really far too narrow. With that column selected, if I go up to the Home tab and the Cells group and the Format button, the bottom of that there is a drop down, and one of the options on there is Autofit column width, and if I select Autofit column width, then it will automatically choose a column width whereby everything in the column K in this case, fits comfortably within the column. Now, in fact, you can apply that command to more than one column at a time. So if I'd actually put data in K, L, M and N, for example, I could select all 4 columns and use that Autofit feature, and all 4 columns would have their widths adjusted to accommodate the data contained within them. What I've done now is to make a mistake in the spelling of September, and having entered the data and got the column width sorted out, I look at it and I think, oh dear, I've spelt September wrongly. To correct an error, if you just click on September in this case and started typing, you would overwrite everything that's in that cell. Now if I don't want to overwrite it, I just want to correct the bit that's wrong. I've got a couple of options. One option is just to press the X button, the cancel button next to the formula bar, and it goes back to what it said before, so I can recover what was there before. The other thing I can always do, remember, in undo, so there's always the undo option. Of course, if I press the undo button too many times, such as here, and undo that correction I made or the change I made to the column width, don't forget I've always got the redo button, and that will redo the column for me. But let's go back to having the September error, so I'm going to redo the September error now. If you want to just edit within a cell, there are a couple of options. I find the simplest way to do it is to select the cell and then click in the formula bar and do the correction actually in the formula bar. So I'm actually looking at the formula bar as I'm typing here. Some people prefer to just click and then click the cursor within the cell, so in this case the K16 cell, and basically look at the cell as they're typing. I find it easier to use the formula bar. By the way, if you don't like the formula bar, you can actually disable it. You might want to have a little exercise now, give you a little extra job to do it. See if you can find in Excel options where the option is to disable the formula bar. If you have trouble finding it, it's on the Advanced tab in the display options, but if you want to get rid of it, perhaps to give yourself a bit more space, you can. I tend to use it, so I tend to keep it on screen pretty much all the time. So I've got my list of months. I'm just going to do a little save here, just save my work. Of course I've got auto save on anyway, but just to be extra safe. Now what I'm going to do against January is to put in the cost of electricity in January. So I'm going to type in 124, hit the enter key, and you can see 124 as the cost. Now, one of the most noticeable things is that when you enter text, such as January, by default it's left aligned. When you enter numbers, by default they are right aligned in the cells. So as I enter these costs, hitting the enter key each time, the numbers are right aligned. However, they don't look much like amounts of money. They just look like any regular numbers. And when you're entering numbers, there are many options for what the numbers actually mean. And one of the things we're going to do here is to actually indicate that these numbers are amounts of money. So let me go back and click on 124. And what I'm going to do on this occasion is to right click, and I'm going to choose Format Cells from the contextual menu. First page, the first tab within that dialog is selected. It's the number tab. And you can see that by default it's taken 124 as a general format number. Note the little tip there. General format cells have no specific number format. But supposing I want to make it a currency amount. Let me click on currency. Now in this case, because I've got myself set up using US currency, I'll tell you more about that later on, it gives me a sample of what the number will look like if I choose this setting. Note the sample there, $724.00. It gives me an option to change the number of decimal places. It also gives me an option to change the symbol that's being used. from a US dollar symbol to just about any other symbol there is, and it gives me a choice of showing negative amounts using either a minus symbol or red or a number in brackets, the sort of accountancy formats. I'm going to stick with the defaults here, click on OK, and 120 is now displayed as $124.00. Now if I now want to apply that same format to the other two numbers there, I can select both of them. I could perform exactly the same operation. It's worth noticing that I can access that Format Cells dialog from a variety of places. Another one is up on the ribbon on the Format button, the bottom part of it, in the Cells group on the Home tab. There is a Format Cells button link there, opens the same dialog. Could do exactly the same thing again, change the currency to the same settings. I can in fact also apply it to the cells that I haven't yet put amounts into, or indeed to the whole of column L. If I selected column L, click again Format Cells. There's a difference this time because when I've selected column L, I've selected a load of cells. 3 of them are in currency format and the rest will still be in the same format they were in before, which was that format. When you make a selection that covers different formats, then when you bring up the Format Cells dialog, Excel doesn't know which of those to show, so it basically indicates that you have a multiple selection by not showing any specific format. What I would need to do now is to make all of the relevant selections. So if I said currency and I say the symbol I want to use is the dollar symbol, everything seems to be OK. 2 decimal places, click on OK. Now that format has been applied to all of those cells, and if I click say in the amount of April and just type say 97.5, press the enter key, then that is automatically formatted with that currency format that I've now applied to all of those cells. So finally then, I filled in the rest of the monthly electricity costs there. I'm going to save that, and that's the end of this section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. We've looked at filling a series of cells. A couple of times already in the course we looked particularly at filling a series of the months of the year. But in fact, many times when you're working with Excel, you'll find that the data follows one or more distinct patterns. Now let me just quickly do again something we've done a couple of times already. I'm just going to type January in that cell. And this little block, this little icon, the bottom right hand corner of the border here, it's called the fill handle. And if I pull the fill handle across, let's just go to there, say, you've already seen that you get the months of the year. Let me just undo that, go back to just having January. But this, instead of pulling across with that fill handle, what I'm going to do is to select the cells up to R4. So I'm going to hold the shift key down, it's R4, and all the cells between G4 and R4 are selected. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the fill drop down in the editing group, the home tab, and I'm going to select fill right. And what happens this time, instead of getting the months of the year, is that I get the same cell content, in this case the word January, in each of those cells. So that isn't a series fill, what we refer to, it's really just a fill right. Now let me undo that yet again. There is a keyboard shortcut for right that you'll probably find yourself using quite a bit. It's Control R. Let me do Control R here, and that gives you a straightforward way of doing a right fill. But in that case what you're doing is effectively copying the contents of one cell into a number of other cells. Let me just go back, let me undo that yet again, and I'm going to type February, in H4. Again, I'm going to select G4, put the Shift key down. Now I'm going to do my right fill again, Control R. What do you think's going to happen? That's right, you still get January in every cell, because basically with my leftmost cell selected, I select the range of cells I want to fill, and basically it goes left to right filling those cells. Now similarly, if I were to hold the Shift key down and click in G14, I could do a fill down, which is Control D, or let me just undo that, click in G4 again, use the fill handle to drag down, and I get a sequence of months again. Now it's important to realize that you can't only fill right and down, you can also do up and left. Let's suppose I put the word hello here. And if I wanted to basically have hello going up the sheet, say I'm starting here in U23. If I select a cell above that, go to the fill drop down, do a fill up. That works the same. And in fact, if I click in M10 with the Shift key held down, so a rectangular selection, I could do a fill left, and so on. So you can basically work in any direction on the sheet, and of course you can do series in any of those directions as well. So if instead of hello in this first cell here, I'd put January, I'd use the fill handle to go left, and then I could even use the fill handle to go up. So as you can see, you can build some pretty sophisticated patterns. Now the examples that I've used here have been relatively straightforward. Now I want something a little bit more complex, and we're going to use a very important series dialog for this example. So in cell H30 I'm going to type a date. I'm going to type a date of the 3rd of January 2015. Let's suppose that I want to do a sequence of cells in row 30 starting on the 3rd of January 2015. I want to have the step as 17 days, a very strange amount. Now to work out what those individual cell values will be, well, 17 plus 3, the next one would be the 20th of January, and then another 17, that's the 6th of February, and so on. But it becomes a little bit complicated to keep going up in steps of 17 days. Well, one way that you can do this is to use the series dialog. And if I click on that fill drop down again, there's an option series, and then it's got a dot dot dot. Now whenever you get a dot 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 on an option on these menus from the ribbon, it means you're going to see a dialog if you click on that. And in this case you have the series dialog, which lets you build very sophisticated series on your worksheets. So first of all, do we want to go in rows or columns? Well, I'm going to go in rows. I'm going to go across the row. What type of series is it going to be? Is it going to be a linear series? Is it going to be a growth series, something that's getting bigger? Is it going to be a date series, or is it some sort of autofill? What I'm going to do is to make this a date series, and the date units I measure are going to be days, but the step value here is going to be 17 days. So I'm going to build a series that goes up 17 days at a time. Now the stop value basically says, where do I want this series to stop? Now I'm going to randomly choose a date. I'm going to say I want it to stop on the 31st of October 2015. And there it is. Notice, as I pointed out earlier in the course, that where the columns aren't wide enough to accommodate those dates, I get the hashes. Let's Select all of those cells. Let's auto fit the column width so you can see them all properly. And there you are, starting at the 3rd of January, 20th of January, 6th of February, 23rd of February, and so on. Now it is true that pretty much any series that you can do with the series dialog, you could actually set up to do using the fill handle type approach. But it can get quite complicated, and you'll quite often find the series dialog is a more convenient way of doing things. You can very simply, for example, just do a series of numbers. It doesn't have to be dates or months or something. If I had a 2 in this cell and a 5 in this cell, let me now extend those with the fill handle. Then I still get a series of numbers increasing 3 at a time. So I can do that without using the series dialog, but the series dialog often makes it a much more straightforward thing to set up. Another point to make here is that, let's go back to that left hand one, let's put 100 in there. If you're using the series dialog, let's say that you're doing, in this case, rows linear, and your step value, instead of being 3 as it was just now, you made -6 and said stop when you get to -100, that's fine as well. And you can of course count down dates as well. So that's it on fill and series fill. In the next section we're going to take a look at flash fill. So please join me. Welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. This is the business expenses worksheet so far. And having found out quite a bit about formatting a worksheet and making sure that everything is starting to look pretty good, what we're now going to do is turn to what is probably Excel's greatest strength, and probably the reason that most people use Excel, which is to do some kind of calculation or analysis. Whether your strength is in calculation or whether you're doing it somewhat reluctantly, you'll find that many of the things that you need to do in Excel are pretty straightforward, and we're going to start with 2 really straightforward examples of calculations in Excel. And in doing that, I'm going to demonstrate the general principles of doing calculations in Excel 2016. So the first thing I'm going to do is to apply a little bit of zoom. Now let's do some work on the total amount of Toby's expenses over the period that is in that table of values. What I'm going to do is to put total in this cell here, F9. And first of all, I'm going to do this whole thing pretty badly, or at least you'll see in a few minutes' time that it was done pretty badly. And that is, I'm just going to put a simple formula in here to add up the figures in column F. Generally speaking, if in a cell, rather than putting a number like an amount of currency or some text like the word travel or a date, you want to put a formula, that's something that involves a calculation, you put an equal sign. And that's how you always begin cell contents where there's a calculation to do, so equals. And now you actually enter the formula. Now, in this case, what I want to do is this. I want the contents of F4, so that's F4, and I just type F4, and then I say plus, and then I want F5, and then I want, and so on. So let me just put the others in, and that's a formula. Now at the moment in the cell you can see the formula, but if I enter that value now, either by hitting the enter key or using the enter tick mark by the formula bar, let's see what happens. I actually get the total amount of the expense claim over that period. Now before we go any further, there's one very important point to recognize here, and that is that cell F9 is now unlike the other cells on this sheet because it has both a value, its value is $305.20, and it has a formula, and its formula is the formula in the bar. So when you click in the formula bar, you see in the formula bar the formula, which you also actually see in the cell in that situation. But if you select the cell, it's the value that you see. So cell F9 has got a formula and a value. And closely associated with that is the fact that without changing the formula, the value may change. So let's suppose that I spot an error in my expenses. Let's suppose that the error I spot is that annual subscription $64.50 should actually be $84.50. So there was a mistake, $20 made there. Let me change it to 84.5. Tick. Automatically the value in F9 is increased by $20. And when change to a cell in Excel, any consequential changes are automatically carried out. So in this case, when I change the value in F7, F7 is part of the formula for F9, so the value of F9 is recalculated as well. So we haven't actually changed the formula in F9, but the value changed because of a change in the value in the cell F7. Now the formula you can see here in F9 is a pretty straightforward formula. It's a formula to add the contents of 5 cells together, and of course in Excel formulae can become extremely complex. And if you look at, say, the length of the formula bar there right across my screen, you could have formula bar full and more than full in terms of the complexity of the formulae that are possible in Excel. But apart from writing out a sum like this, equals F4 plus F5 plus F6, etc., there are some other ways of doing things like total column of figures that are actually much more efficient ways of doing things. And I'm going to demonstrate one of those to you next. But just before I do, I want to point out one other thing that relates to something that I said earlier as well. If I were to put additional expense in here, so let's suppose that I realized that there was another expense for the 10th of March, March the 10th, that I'd forgotten to include. Let me select row 7 and insert an additional row. Let's go back and see what the formula is in what is now F10. Look at the formula. It's F4 plus F5 plus F6 plus F8 plus F9. What Excel can do is to compensate for things like inserting and deleting rows and columns. So not only do you not need to worry about that because Excel takes care, but obviously you can use that to your advantage. Now let me just undo that. And I'm actually going to delete F9. So don't forget, when I've got that selected, I can either just press the delete key, or I could say clear all, although of course in all will clear formulas, and it will clear contents, and it will clear formats. It'll clear absolutely everything, so that's all cleared. And now I'm going to take a different approach to adding up that column of figures. And the approach I'm going to take is this. I'm going to select F4, keep the mouse key down, drag down to the bottom, and just include F9. Then I'm going to release the mouse key. Now I mentioned this little icon down here before. Ignore that for the moment, the quick analysis icon. Don't worry about that for the moment. What we're going to do is to go up to the editing group on the ribbon, and next to the auto sum button, we're going to choose sum. And unsurprisingly, the total we get is back to $325.20, the same as before. Have a formula in F9, but it's a very different formula to the one we had before, because it now uses the Excel function of sum. And the general format for a function is that you'll have the name of the function, in this case sum. Then you'll normally have a set of brackets, and then in this case there is called a range of cells. So it's a range from F4 to F8, and the range is indicated by a starting cell, then a colon, then the ending cell in the range. Now in this case those two cells are in the same column, but in fact they could be in different rows and columns. So a range is actually a rectangle of cells, and in this case the top left of the rectangle is F4 and the bottom right of the rectangle is F8. So we have a little sort of subcolumn of cells. So in that formula we're using the function sum. Now one of the big advantages of using the sum function there is you haven't got to type in the list of cell names. But there are some other advantages to it as well, and let me do what I did just now and insert a row corresponding to a missing expense. So let me select row 7 again, do an insert, and let's now look at that formula. And the formula is still just equals sum, but in this case not only does it cover the correct range from F4 to now F9, but if I put a value in here, let's say I put a value in there of say 1730, it would be included in the calculation. Because by using that function I didn't have to specifically mention the new F7. All I needed to say was the range, and F7 is automatically included because in that range. So that's a big advantage of using a function here. Now let me just undo that last couple of operations. And the other thing that is particularly useful about this approach, let's suppose that instead of adding up those expense amounts, I wanted for some reason to find which the largest was. If I click within the formula bar and delete the word sum and instead change it to the word max, what I'll see there is the max figure in that column. So the maximum amount is 127.50. Or what about the average figure? Now, as I start typing that function name, a whole list of the functions that begin with the letter A appears. And at this point, if I wanted to just scroll down, find the one I want, average, that's the one I want. Let's take that, tick that. The average expense amount is $65.04. In Excel 2016 there is a very large number of functions available. So in this section I've introduced you to the basics of formulas and functions. In the next section we'll start looking at some more complex calculations and how to set those up efficiently and effectively in Excel 2016. So I'll see you then. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. We're now turn our attention back to the core of Excel, and having looked briefly at formulae and functions earlier on, we're now going to look at functions in particular in a lot of detail in this section and in fact the next few sections. Now there are actually hundreds of functions in Excel, and some of them require quite a detailed knowledge of particular areas such as statistics, mathematics and so on. But I'm going to concentrate on some of the most common functions that you're likely to need, particularly when you're just starting out with Excel and as your knowledge and use of Excel develops. Now in order to learn about some of these functions, I'm going to develop an invoice for a bathroom company called Shower Power, who are based in the USA. Basically they put together and install bathrooms and shower rooms for people. Now as part of this they have to produce invoices, and their invoices are not just simple documents that somebody enters in a word processing application such as Word. Their invoices involve accessing very simple types of database with details of the products they use and with details of their customers. And the invoice that we're going to develop in the coming sections is going to be based on the use of what are effectively databases of information and Excel functions. So let's get started. Now one of the first things I need to explain to you is what I mean by databases. You may be worried at this point that I'm going to start teaching you how to use Access or something like that. Very many commercial databases are operated purely on the basis of use of Microsoft Excel. And one of the things that I hope you'll see in this and the next few sections is how, in effect, you can set up a database system in Excel. Now, with this particular workbook, Shower Power Invoice.xlsx, I've already created a total of 3 sheets, and one of the sheets, the third one there, is actually customers. Now, in effect, the contents of that customers sheet is a very small example of a part of a database. I have information about 4 customers. Each has an account number, the name of the customer, it's a company name, the name of the contact at the company, at the customer, and then I have the terms for that customer, whether the customer receives a discount, and the first 2 lines of the company's address. Now, in reality, I would have many other pieces of information about each of these customers, but I think you'll get the hang of all this on the basis of just the amount of information that's there. The second worksheet shows the list of parts that Shower Power supplies, and for each part there's a product code, a description, a quantity or size, a list price, and a discount percentage where a discount is applied. Now, you'll notice that in column F there is a column which is supposed to contain the net price, the price after discount of any particular part. So where a discount is applied, this would give the net price. And in effect, one of the little design decisions we might make would be whether we would store the discounted prices on the sheet or whether we actually calculate them in the invoice itself. You'll see what I mean by this a little bit later on. So in effect, that list of customers and that list of parts is the basis of our database. And what we're going to do is to use this information to create invoices. Now, the first sheet is my sort of invoice template, and all that I've put on this invoice template at the moment is some fixed information. So for example, I put the word invoice at the top, I've put Shower Power, the company name there, and then a few headings. At the bottom I've got please contact the customer services department, thank you for your business, etc. So what I'm now going to do is to start to fill in on this invoice various parts which are variable. So these are the parts that will be different between customers. I'm not necessarily going to put all of these in, but I'm going to add quite a few of them over this and the next few sessions. Now, one thing you may already have noticed about the invoice is that there are no lines shown. I'm not going to show horizontal and vertical lines on this invoice, but very often if you're working in Excel and you're trying to align things, it is a good idea to show the grid lines while you're working. So what I'm going to do is to go to the View tab and switch the grid lines on. That will help quite a bit with alignment and seeing where we need to do anything with cells and rows and columns and so on. And what I'm going to do first in this section is to show you how to use a lookup function, and the function we're going to use is called VLOOKUP. What I'm going to do is to put an account number in here, and on the basis of that account number I'm going to get some detail of the relevant customer and put them up here to represent part of the customer's address. So I'm going to put them up here. So let's go over to the customer's sheet and let's look. The first account number I've got there is 2307. So let's go back and put 2307 in the account number. And then what I want to do is to put into this cell here, D5, the name of the customer contact. Now, of course, if I look at the customer's sheet, I can see who that is. It's Dorothy Walensky. But I want that to happen automatically. And the way that I do it is to use the VLOOKUP function. Now, if I go to the Formulas tab, you'll see on the Formulas tab a function library. And within the function library, one category of function is lookup and reference. So click on lookup and reference. And the one I'm going to use here is VLOOKUP. There is also an HLOOKUP. VLOOKUP stands for vertical lookup. HLOOKUP stands for horizontal And which of those you use depends on how your data is arranged on your reference sheet, in this case my customers sheet. In this case my customer records are arranged vertically, so I'm going to look at the VLOOKUP function. I'm going to use the VLOOKUP function. Now what you see is this function arguments dialog, a very clever little dialog, which is going to make it very straightforward for us to set this up. But I want you to read carefully the information about how this function works. Looks for a value in the leftmost column of a table and then returns a value in the same row from a column you specify. By default, the table must be sorted in an ascending order. Now, the very first thing we're going to enter here is going to be the lookup value. But before we do that, let's just check that our table is in ascending order. So let me cancel this. Let me go back to my customers sheet, and my account numbers, they're not in ascending order, 23073210, and then they're out of order. Now I could do a little bit of cut and paste, put those in the right order. Alternatively, I can easily sort a sheet, in this case by default on the first column. If I just select that sheet, go to the Data tab, in the Sort and Filter group that I'm going to talk a lot more about later in the course, this top left hand button here, Sort Smallest to Largest, by default works on the first column. So that sorts everything into the correct sequence. So now the table I'm going to look up is in the correct sequence. So let's go back to the invoice. Let's once again go to Formulas, Lookup and Reference, back to VLOOKUP. Now we can proceed. Now the value we're going to look up on the customers sheet is the value in C17. I could type in that first box in the function arguments dialog C17, but in fact if I click in there, Excel does it for me. Now the next I specify is the table array. Notice as I click through these fields that an explanation of what each of those fields is given lower down in the dialog. Table array is a table of text, numbers or logical values in which data is retrieved. Table array can be a reference to a range name. I'm going to talk about range names later on. For the moment we're going to make it a table array. So I'm going to click on the customers sheet. Note how that dialog is on top. Now let me select the array that contains all of my data. So that's the cells from A2 to G5. And that is my table array. Customers, bang, so the customers sheet A2 to G5. Now the third field is the col index num. It's the column number in the table array from which the matching value will be returned. Now the first thing I want here is the name of the contact. So that's actually the third column. So the column number is 3, the number 3. And now finally what we need to enter is range lookup. Now this is a logical value that determines whether we're looking for a closest match, in which we put true in here, or whether we want to find an exact match. Now in this case we must have an exact match on account number, so we type in here false, on OK, and we find in cell D5 on the invoice that we have the name Dorothy Walensky. Now that appears to be fine. Let's just do a check. Let me look for one of the other account numbers. What about 5112? Let's put the other account number in cell C17, 5112, ticket. That's good, I get Zach Stevens, so that seems to be fine. Now what would I put in the next cell down? That's what I have in cell D5. What would I put in D6? Well, let's just try doing a fill down, shall we? You probably already worked out that this isn't going to work at all, but let's do it anyway. Of course it doesn't work at all, because what doesn't work at all here is that Excel just moves everything down a row, in which case C17 is no longer C17, it's looking for C18, which won't help at all. The lookup table on the customer sheet is no longer A2 to G5, it's put A3 to G6, so definitely doesn't work. The one we're getting around this, of course, would be to do the VLOOKUP individually on any of those cells. But another way of doing it, and probably the better way of doing it, when we set up the VLOOKUP, is to use absolute cell references for the cell references, because C17 isn't going to change and the range on the customer sheet isn't going to change either. So let me put absolute cell references in here. Okay, that's better. Now let me do a fill down for, say, 4 rows, because it'll help a little bit. I'll get Zach Stevens every time. But if what I really want here, instead of Zach Stevens 4 times, is the company name, then the first line of the address, then the second line of the address, let's look at the customer sheet. The company name is column 2 and the address is in columns 6 and 7. So let's go back to the invoice. Let's say that one is column 2, that one is column 6. Notice I'm only changing the column number. That one is column 7. That looks better. Now let's go back to that earlier account number again, 2307 ticket, and that's fine. That seems to be working perfectly. So finally in this section, what I'd like to do is to put the customer's terms of business in here. Now that's from column 4 on the customer's sheet. So if I just take one of these, do a copy, Control C, do a paste, Control V, look at the formula, change that to column 4, ticket, and as you can see, 7 days. Let's try changing the account number, 5112, ticket, and as you can see, that works perfectly as well. That's the VLOOKUP function. Please join. Welcome back to our course on Excel 2016. In this section we're going to start to look at what many people consider to be one of the greatest strengths of Excel. That is the ability to create really good graphs and charts. So people use graphs and charts in Excel. Well, usually it's to strengthen a message, or sometimes to actually give the message itself. As the saying goes, a picture can paint 1,000 words, and very often, particularly with complex data, a picture can help people to understand the data without getting too baffled by all of the numbers. Now I should warn you that the area of graphs and charts in Excel is a pretty vast area, so we're going to start with the basics as usual, and I'm going to use some very straightforward data here about the lengths of a number of rivers in Africa and the drainage basins for some of the rivers. And what I'm going to do first of all is to create a straightforward graph or chart to illustrate the length of those 8 rivers. So let's just ignore the drainage basins for a moment. What I'm going to do first of all is to select the data that I want to draw the graph or chart of. So I select from A1 down to B9, and then I go to the Insert tab, and one of the groups on the Insert tab is Charts, and I'm going to click first on Recommended Charts, because once you've selected some data, what Excel 2016 can do for you is to recommend a suitable type of chart. The recommendations it makes are on the left here. There are 4 of them. First of all, it says clustered column. Now I'm going to assume that you're not very familiar with types of graph and chart, although many of you will be. I'll briefly explain each as we go along. A clustered column, basically we have vertical columns, and each column corresponds to a category. Now Excel assumes in this case that the categories are in column A, so A2 down to A9, so we have a category Okavango and a category Orange and so on. And then on the vertical scale, on the vertical axis, it plots what it calls the value, and the values in this case are the lengths of the rivers. So as you can see, it's taken each of our rivers and plotted a column. Now note the little summary underneath the chart. clustered column chart is used to compare values across a few categories. Use it when the order of categories is not important. The second option it offers is really similar, but it's flipped over. It's what's called a clustered bar chart. This time the categories are on the vertical axis, the values are horizontal, so you're looking at the lengths of the rivers as horizontal bars. The third category it offers is a pie chart. Now, pie charts most people are familiar with. We slice a pie up in a portion. And here we come to a very important point. When Excel is looking at the data that you've selected, it has no idea what it means. And in this case, if you're used to charts or statistics and so on, you probably realize that a pie chart would be an extremely bad choice of chart here, because a pie chart implies that you're dividing something, you're dividing the pie into parts. Now these 8 rivers, the lengths of them do not, when added up, add to a whole something. It's not sort of the length of all the rivers in the world or something like that, and it's divided between these 8. They happen to have those 8 lengths, but those 8 lengths added together don't form a total of something. So a pie chart will not be suitable. However, Excel doesn't know that. You understand this, Excel doesn't. So it offers you a pie chart, and you need to be aware of the meaning of pie charts to realize that this is not a suitable chart in this case. The fourth option is one of the new types of chart in Excel 2016, and it's what's called a Pareto chart. Now I'm not going to talk about Pareto charts at the moment. It's associated with something you may have heard of called Pareto or Pareto analysis. Again, this would not be a suitable chart in this case. I'll come back to Pareto a little bit later on in the course. So really the best choices here will be either the column chart or the bar chart. Either of them are possible. Some people avoid column charts in this kind of situation because quite often people associate the columns as in some way progressing with time. Of course, in this case there is no progression with time, and anybody looking at this clustered column chart, should we to draw it, certainly should not imply any change over time. But because sometimes people make this time inference, many people would go for the clustered bar in this case, but in effect either of them are totally suitable. Now before I actually draw the chart in this case, what I want to do is to take a look at the All Charts tab in the Insert Chart dialog, because listed there you effectively see all of the available chart types. And in addition, at the very top you've got a tab that says Recent, which shows you the recently created types of chart. Gives you quick access to the ones you've used most recently. You also have access to any chart templates that you may have created or acquired, and then you have a list of all the different chart types. Now the fact that you have selected the data of the type that you have will to a large extent determine which types of chart you can actually draw from that data. And in fact, with a very straightforward selection like the selection here, most of these charts you could draw, but some of them you couldn't. For instance, you couldn't draw a stock chart, because for a stock chart you need high, low and close stock market figures to be selected, and Excel can tell that what you have here is not high, low and close figures. Often, and particularly when you've got used to the different types of chart in Excel, you may go to this All Charts tab here and go straight to the sort of chart that you want to select. Now in addition, let me now cancel that. I will come back to it in a moment. If you go back to the Charts group, there are a number of icons within the group which represent the most popular types of charts. So you've got things like hierarchy chart, waterfall or stock chart, and then you've got statistical charts, and most of these have drop downs, and on the drop down you have the main charts of that particular type, and then usually access to some more. And then in the bottom right hand corner of the charts group there's a little dialog box launcher, and that gets you back into the Insert Chart dialog. So as you can see, there's a very wide range of charts, and to some extent, if you haven't done this sort of thing before, you really need to rely on a bit of experience, and you'll soon find that you start to know which charts to use in each situation. So I'm going to create now a clustered column chart. So I'm going to click on OK, and there is my chart. Now to the right of it you will see 3 buttons. There's one with a plus, one with a pen, with a filter on it. I'm going to talk about those later on in the course, so don't worry about those at the moment. Let's concentrate for now on the chart area itself. Within the chart area there are a number of things. There's the chart itself, of course. You can see the vertical columns. You have a horizontal axis with the categories on it. In this case the categories are the names of the rivers. And then on the left hand side you can see the scale for the vertical axis, and the vertical axis in this case contains the values, and the values are the lengths in kilometers. Now there are many other things that you can add to charts, as we're going to see, and to some extent Excel does its best job to make your chart complete as quickly as possible. But sometimes what it does is not really up to the job. So for instance, if I hover over length kilometers here, what Excel has done is to make length brackets kilometers the chart title. It didn't actually have anything else to use, so it used that. I definitely want to give this chart a better title than that, and I'm going to do that in section. But you can see here the basics of a straightforward chart, some of the main features. Now as we'll see in the next section, there are many ways that we can customize this, as I've already said. When you have a chart selected like this one, you get 2 additional tabs on the ribbon, and these 2 tabs, there's a design tab and a format tab, are described together as the chart tools. And with those chart tools we can do all sorts of things in terms of changing the design. So for instance, we can use this gallery of chart styles here and completely change the style of the chart. And then with the format tab we can do a lot in terms of individually formatting the way the text appears and so on, but more of that later. One very straightforward thing you can do is to resize a chart just by using the resizing handle. So for instance, if I wanted to make this chart bigger, I'd hover over the top left hand corner, get the appropriate cursor, release the cursor, and my chart is much bigger. A thing that you can do with a chart, and this is in fact a very important feature, is that you can move a chart. By default it's created on the same sheet as the data which it is representing, but sometimes you may want the chart to be created on a completely different sheet, or indeed you may want to create it on a special type of sheet called a chart sheet. And a chart sheet is unlike a regular worksheet. It's, if you like, the other type of worksheet in that it doesn't contain cells where you use formulae and functions and so on. It's there really to hold a chart. And chart sheets can be very helpful, particularly if, for example, you want to do a presentation with a chart in it and you don't want the presentation to be sort of confused by having the data in the background as you have here, or even by having lots of cells and rows and columns and things. Basically you can have the chart sitting on its own. I should point out, of course, that when you've got a chart you can very easily copy it into a completely different type of Office document, such as a PowerPoint presentation or a Word document. Let me show you how to move this sheet. Let's go back to the Chart Tools Design tab. At the right hand end in the Location group there is a Move Chart button, and then basically I'm given a choice, and the choice is to either keep this as an object in the Rivers sheet, or in fact I could put it in any other available worksheet, or I can move it to a chart sheet. In this case I'm going to move it to a new chart sheet. I'm going to call the chart sheet River Lengths Chart, and I'm going to click on OK. And there is the chart on its own chart sheet, and as you can see the chart sheet doesn't have the background with the cells and rows and columns, and particularly if you were to hide the ribbon and the formula bar you could make a very straightforward presentation of the lengths of the rivers without any sort of distractions. So that's it. That's how to create a basic chart. In the next section we're going to look at customization. So